it's interesting that when we think of this, we often think and we're worried about things and we're thinking about everything falling apart today, financially and monetarily. So you write a book, The Fall and Rise of American Finance. And your argument for how strong the Fed is today working with BlackRock, it's in some ways it's sort of scary for me, and and uh, and I'm wondering, how do we work in the future to change things? Um, and Professors Maher and Professor Aquanno are looking at 4 periods of history and dividing up economic development in the United States, going back from the late 1800s up until the present, and the present being this, we can call it this Fed BlackRock state. Also, though, I think you mentioned there's a turn in the 1970s, and we'll get in. You'll get. I'm going to give you the floor in a second. And both Professor Aquano is in Toronto, and Professor Maher is in New York, and they work like Mud and Jeff soulmates in getting this work done together. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I congratulate both of you
Thank
for
you.
that.
Thank
And
you.
and we're in a learning mode. We have a lot of thought and history about money and its history in seniorage. And so we're coming to this with a very narrow focus. And Zarlenga was telling us, if we can change the crux of the problem, the dominoes will fall in a positive way to change the other things. I could have shown him talking about economic violence and trying to wake up AMI and economists to serious problems going on. And indeed, when we try to work towards a better climate and better environment, jobs for everybody, and we see how little power and how there's much greater awareness, but we have so much more to do, and we've got to work on connecting with a larger movement. So we welcome you being here, and we want to connect into a larger society. We're not funded by the government or any corporations, so we're a citizens learning group, and we have connections going outward all the way around the world. There's 30 organizations in our study groups in different countries, some being very large, say in England, or ones in Europe, in Sweden and Germany, to ones being much smaller in other parts of the world that are forming. And so, and we're, since we do have this narrow background, from what I'm reading in your book, is you're going to open up things, and we're going to look at, it's like opening up a can and saying, "Oh, look at what's inside." And it's going to be different. And so we're on a learning curve, and thank you for being here. And
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephen.
please get started. And if you have any questions of us, feel free to ask at any time too, of where we're at, what our thoughts are. But you got a little taste with Professor Mattei being here, so that was wonderful too. Thank you. Please.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for having us, Stephen, and also thanks to Patrick Levine Rose, who I think also was very involved in putting this all together and having us here. And so we both really appreciate that. And it seems like a really great, institution, a really great organization. And so we're both really happy to be able to speak to you guys. Although it is a little challenging to follow Clara Mattei. I feel a little bit like the high school band that has to go on after the Rolling Stones or something like that. We'll do our best. But it is a challenge. Her presentation was obviously excellent, and I think there's a lot of threads that she kind of touched on in her comments that I think we can really pick up on, and just kind of think about a little bit more, maybe from a slightly different angle. And I think one of the key things, and one of the reasons that we wrote this book, is that, how we think about finance and the role of finance in the capitalist economy has enormous implications for how we act politically and how we orient politically and how we engage politically, what we see the political task before us as being, and how we understand, how to make the world a better place. And I also want to pick up, I think I really admired and want to echo Professor Mattei's comments on, the condemning and drawing attention to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I think it behooves us when we're talking about, when we're putting forward our ideas about, capitalism and the economy, to really think about how that ongoing genocide leads us to reflect on the nature of the capitalist system and what's enabling that to happen. And I think one thing that's immediately apparent, obviously, is that Israel has overwhelming military power that it's unleashing against largely civilian captive population in Gaza, now also in Lebanon. And there's been so little resistance to that violence from the Arab states as well as from Iran, despite some kind of token actions and so on, mostly rhetorical in nature. And so I think, it's worth kind of thinking about, why is this? And what does it say about the nature of our global capitalist economic system that it's going on and on and on? And one term that I think it draws, that it points to the importance of, one concept, one theory, is the notion of empire. And for Marxist political economy, empire can't just be an epithet. It can't just be a term we apply to stuff we don't like, right? Empire is a system. And military power is one element of the imperial system called the American empire. But the Fed and global finance are equally important. And in creating the conditions whereby Israel, for example, can carry out a genocide without end for 1 year, with apparently no holds barred, with so little resistance from the other states in the region. And so part of where Scott and I were kind of starting from in putting this book together was to try to understand. We're starting from the arguments of, Panitch and Gindin, the late Leo Panitch in The Making of Global Capitalism, about how, interlinked finance and state power actually creates the structural basis for the imperial power of the United States, for the global empire led by the United States, by integrating formally independent states into a singular global capitalism, rather than fragmented regional or local or state-based capitalisms, one singular coherent global capitalism. So finance and the global integration of finance is then not about the decline of the American state or the American empire. It's not about the decline of American industrial capitalism. It's a structural foundation for extending the power of American empire and the American state. And so I think that has a lot to do with the way that we see the conflict in the Middle East now playing out. And so in this respect, I think it becomes clear that, many on the left have it wrong, right? Finance is about extending and supporting and a condition for American power, not about the decline of American power. And Scott and I, in our book, we talk a lot about how, the role of finance has been to intensify the competitive disciplines that have ultimately enabled the American multinational corporations at the center of global capitalism to remain as strong and dynamic as they have been since World War II. And I think this also speaks to the total failure of capitalist states around the world to do anything whatsoever about the massive ecological catastrophe unfolding around us every single day, for which capital is also responsible. Again, the ecological crisis itself, as well as the failure of capitalist states around the world to take any meaningful steps toward resolving it, is not about the failure or crisis of capital, but it's about the very success and the strength of capital, because that success of capital in its expanded reproduction involves destroying and unsustainably reconfiguring ecosystems. So the point that Scott and I would draw attention to, as opposed to some of the more social democratic type political views, is that this is not the problem is not that we have to restore competitiveness, that the capitalist system is, monopolistic, full of, large uncompetitive, dominated by large uncompetitive corporations, but rather that competitiveness is the problem. Competitiveness is the problem. And so, in that context, insofar as finance has intensified the competitiveness of capital, enabled the global integration of global capitalism that has been a structural foundation for the U.S. empire, we should really not be talking about finance. We should stop talking about finance and start talking about capitalism, because finance is significant precisely because of the way that it has served to enhance the flexibility and dynamism of capitalism, and particularly the historical form that takes today, which is the American empire. Okay, so the way that we go about making this case is by tracing the fall and rise of the U.S. Of the financial system in the U.S., as we call it, from the days of the robber baron J.P. Morgan all the way to the contemporary rise of BlackRock after the 2008 crisis. And so we kind of begin our narrative in the late 19th century, as you pointed out, Stephen. But really, we're looking at how the great investment banking empire of J.P. Morgan collapsed, and gradually over the course of the century or so between then and 2008 was rebuilt. American financial power was rebuilt. And part and parcel of that process, of course, is the construction of the American empire. And one of the things, and this too echoes a point that Professor Mattei made. One of the things we really wanted to do in this book, as we were aiming to really provide a kind of accessible and non-technical narrative account about how the financial system developed in the U.S., how it works today, and its role in sustaining the class power of the capitalist class, and the dynamism of the system itself. And as we were doing that, despite wanting to keep it accessible, we also really wanted to kind of bring in post-Keynesian and Marxian theories of money, credit, and finance, bring them into the analysis in a historical way. So we present these theories in the context of our account of the development and restructuring of the financial system, and we aim to show how the capacities, the institutional capacities of the state and the financial system developed over time to support the dynamism and flexibility of capital in the way that those theories describe. So the fundamental point of the book is to challenge the idea that finance is parasitic on industry, which we see made very commonly on the left and center left, right? Everybody from Hillary Clinton to Bernie Sanders seems to assume, and of course Donald Trump as well in many respects, seems to argue and assume that finance is somehow a parasitic force on the real industrial economy, leading to the hollowing out of the real economy, the decline of industrial capitalism, and whatnot. And what Scott and I are really trying to show is actually that finance is at the very heart of what has made capitalism so dynamic and so resilient over the period since the 19th century, thereby repeatedly defying predictions of the imminent collapse of capitalism under the weight of its supposedly inexorable contradictions, right? Beginning with Marx himself, right? I mean, Marxists have been arguing that capitalism is about to collapse since like 1858, right? And that's always been wrong. And declinism has been also a common theme among kind of Marxist economic analysis. And so we are really trying to push back on that, and we're trying to show how the development of the financial system and its connection to the state has been at the heart of what has made capital so dynamic, and as it's continued to develop since the 19th century. And so we do this by recounting the history of capitalist development in the U.S. from the fall of J.P. Morgan's empire all the way to the rise of BlackRock, as I was mentioning. And so Scott is going to just lay out a little bit of how we kind of see that history, and then I'm going to come back in at the end and kind of make a couple additional points, and then we'll pass it over for discussion.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve, and hello, everybody. As Steve mentioned, the book traces the fall and rise of American financial power from the 1800s to present, and really presents an alternative history of American finance that both challenges popular perspectives and provides an account of the development of the U.S. financial system and the different institutional forms that financialization has taken. We trace the current hegemony of finance all the way back to the 1930s and show that the history of financialization has four distinct phases: a classical finance capital phase, a managerial phase, a neoliberal phase, and a new finance capital phase. These phases form a cycle consisting of the decline and then the yet gradual, uneven, and contradictory rebuilding of financial power. We show that each phase is characterized by specific organized forms of state, corporate, and class power, and that these phases are marked not by sharp breaks, but rather by continuity and change. Moreover, we show that each phase is punctuated by a major crisis managed by a relatively autonomous state, acting in the general interests of capital. For us, the contradictions of capitalism can never really be fully resolved, and the system must change continuously to overcome the barriers and crises it generates. So, over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll first briefly outline each of the four stages of financialization we identify, and second, draw out a few of the core arguments that we developed through this historical analysis of the US financial system. So first, the classical finance capital period, which we chart roughly from 1880 to 1929. During this period, ownership and control of industry came to be centered around large investment banks, above all JP Morgan, which themselves, of course, sat at the center of the national banking system, which developed in the 1860s. The result here was a fusion between financial and industrial capital under the leadership of the banks, what Rudolf Hilferding called finance capital. By the end of the 1800s, finance capitalists had formed hundreds of corporations, including US Steel, International Harvester, and GE, by basically merging together smaller firms. The power of these banks hinged on two things. One, their ability to issue credit, and two, their ownership of equity. Their control over credit not only gave them long-term interest in the health of individual firms, but led to a certain degree of influence over corporate decision-making, while their position as the largest stockholders allowed them to acquire seats on boards and to establish interlocking directors of firms they controlled. So within this system of finance capital, investment banks played an active and direct role in the management of industrial corporations. I want to really flag that, an active and direct role in the management of industrial corporations. They shaped the strategic direction and organizational structure of the corporations they controlled. But critically, this period of finance capital was not characterized by financial firms micromanaging the day-to-day operations of industrial firms. Finance capital was not then, nor is it now, about that. Rather, financial firms exercised more general, but nonetheless direct control over a network of industrial firms. So finance capital and the development of the financial system during this period depended on the continuous expansion of the state's economic functions. And this is a kind of a core thread that runs throughout the analysis. For example, we show the creation of the Federal Reserve marked a deep transformation in the logic of money and banking. The Fed integrated the banking system with state power in a new way, further blurring the relationship between state money on the one hand and private credit money on the other hand. In fact, it was during this period that you see the formation of the modern system of hybrid money, though this remained linked to the gold system and not yet fully based around the credit generating capacities of the Federal Reserve. The second period we look at, the managerial period, starts around 1930 and lasts to around 1979. This period, of course, emerged out of the Great Depression and through the regulations enacted by the state in response to the collapse, the total collapse of the banking system. These regulations formally separated banks from the governance of industrial firms, leading to a separation between ownership and control. Those who own the firm, shareholders, were now formally different from those who controlled the firm, managers. With the end of finance capital and the fusion between these things, investment banks became intermediaries. So this is the structural transformation of the financial system that we're seeing here. Investment banks supported the issuance and sale of corporate securities to other buyers. And most importantly, the financial system came to pivot around now commercial banks. These banks were ever more tightly connected to the state, and they came to play a pivotal role in the internationalization of the US dollar. And so what you see here is first the stabilization and then the extension of the form of hybrid money developed in the earlier period. Yet this was a period in which insider corporate managers were the preeminent force in the economy, we show. This is a period of industrial hegemony. We trace this power of inside managers during this period to the fragmentation of equity holdings associated with New Deal regulations, to high levels of retained earnings, and to state investment. So to be sure, like with the absence of large blocks of shareholdings, managers were able to control industrial firms without facing a coherent challenge from inside investors. And high retained earnings allowed industrial firms to independently finance investments and to avoid dependence on the banking system. While the significant state intervention in these firms through the military-industrial complex, which emerged from the Second World War, greatly supported the profitability and independence of these firms. So the hegemony of industrial corporations in this period was fully supported by the New Deal state, which was focused to a greater degree on legitimation and was a tax state. We showed the separation of the banks from industrial corporations during this period led to the internalization of a range of financial functions inside industrial corporations. So first, these firms, these industrial corporations during this period, precisely because of the restrictions put on finance, developed extensive capacities to raise and to lend credit. Second, within the industrial corporation, general managers themselves increasingly became financiers, managing a portfolio of assets. As firms grew in size and diversified and internationalized their operations, top managers were no longer tasked with overseeing concrete production functions, but rather came to circulate money between different units, as financiers would. So corporate financialization, we find, was therefore in many respects a direct outcome of the success and profitability of the post-war golden age of capitalism. We're seeing a different form of financialization take hold during the post-war golden age. And so the financialization of the non-financial corporation actually originated in the heart of the post-war golden age. Now, this managerial system, of course, as I noted earlier, was inherently crisis-prone, as union rights and New Deal programs posed barriers to accumulation, preventing the necessary restructuring. A profit crisis emerged in the 1970s. And this was only resolved through the neoliberal authoritarian state and the further financialization and globalization of the economy. And so that takes me now to the third period, the neoliberal period, from 1980 to 2008. During this period, the hegemony of industry was overtaken, we argue, by a new form of financial power. This was the result of, one, the integration of global financial markets, which provided the essential infrastructure for corporations to circulate value across internationalized production networks, right? Financialization underpins globalization and underpins all the intensified processes of exploitation that globalization has brought. Two, this new form of financial hegemony was the result of the proliferation of worker pension funds managed by professional money managers. These funds and other institutional investment funds, but primarily these funds, reconcentrated stock holdings and ended the fragmentation of ownership that characterized the managerial period. Nevertheless, this period was still subject to an important trade-off. Financial firms could either own a large portion of a small number of companies or a small portion of a large number of companies. During the neoliberal period, financial institutions thus once again came to wield significant power over industrial firms through the concentration and centralization of corporate stock. What we see here again is a transformation in corporate organization and corporate governance in the favor of financial firms and financialized institutions. Yet rather than financial firms exercising direct control over networks of firms, as in the period of classical financial capital, they exerted broad structural discipline. This regime of financial hegemony was centered around the banks, as well as so-called institutional investors, including investment banks, broker-dealers, and hedge funds. And these institutions were linked together within a new system of market-based finance, which depended on a complicated chain of financial exchanges to generate credit. The market-based financial system integrated money markets, capital markets, and derivative markets, and developed around a new form of private money called repo or shadow money that has increasingly come to dominate credit relations, although it sits on top of, if you will, the system of hybrid bank money that was established in the earlier periods. So what you see here is the development of new monetary relations through the development of new institutional forms within the financial system taking place in this period. We argue, furthermore, the neoliberal state supporting this vast configuration of corporate and class power was one organized around debt. As taxes were slashed to restore corporate profits, state programs were increasingly financed through debt, enhancing the discipline of finance over state budgets, right? And two, the state was deeply authoritarian, insofar as power was concentrated within unaccountable state institutions, including the OCC, the CFTC, the FDIC, and of course, most importantly, the Federal Reserve. Indeed, we show that neoliberal economic policy was characterized by the subordination of fiscal policy to monetary policy. And of course, we have to understand neoliberal austerity in terms of that subordination and in terms of the restructuring of the hierarchy of state institutions, which occurred alongside the reconstitution of financial hegemony during this period. Okay, but there's a fourth period. The story doesn't end there, we argue. The new finance capital period begins, we argue, in the 2008 during the 2008 crisis, and exists presently. This fourth period, the new finance capital period, emerged from the 2008 crisis and the state-led restructuring that followed. This crisis was in many respects, of course, as deep as the Great Depression, and it originated, it's important to understand, within the market-based financial system. And without that understanding, it's difficult to understand and make sense of the state restructuring that followed. And one could fall into, we see, very problematic traps about characterizing this as, a form of political extraction without understanding the Fed's role within the financial system and how, in fact, it was reacting to a generalized crisis in credit provision. And this takes on many of the hallmarks, in fact, of what the New Deal state did in the aftermath of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Okay, so new finance capital, as the name indicates, marks a new form of fusion between financial and industrial capital. And of course, this takes us back, right, or is reminiscent of the classical period of finance capital that I started with. What we see, therefore, during this period is that the diffuse financial power of neoliberal shareholder capitalism became centralized. And it was centralized within giant asset management companies. And these asset management companies have come to exert control, direct and active control over industrial capital. The pooling of already large pools of funds within institutional investors by these asset management companies have allowed the big three, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, to hold large proportions of a large number of firms and have become so-called universal owners. The big three, and the numbers here are staggering, the big three are collectively the largest or second largest shareholders in firms that comprise nearly 90% of market capitalization in the US economy. This includes 98% of firms on the S&P 500 index, which, as we know, tracks the largest American companies, with the big three owning on average of more than 20% in each company. In this way, asset management companies have further centralized financial power, gaining a degree of economic dominance unseen since the days of J.P. Morgan. And this represents a significant transformation in U.S. corporate capitalism, and of course is tied into the restructuring of the state and the restructuring of the economic system the state participates in and drives. But, and this is where our analysis really differs from much of the literature and contributes to it. Despite the extreme concentration of stock ownership, we show this regime is intensely competitive. Asset management companies compete not only with one another, but also with all other outlets for savings, including banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms. And to attract savings, these firms seek to maximize, they must seek to maximize returns for clients. They must offer better results and lower risk than their competitors. Now, such competition, of course, imposes sharp limits on the fee rates these firms can charge. But critically, it also leads them to directly intervene in their portfolio firms to maximize the profitability of these firms, and thus to maximize their own AUM, assets under management, and their own profitability. If we believe these firms are profit-maximizing institutions, we must also understand that they are interested in intervening and have an economic incentive in intervening within their portfolio firms. And the evidence demonstrates this. In 2020, BlackRock held over 3,500 company engagements, covering nearly 65% of global equity under management, while Vanguard engaged with companies representing 52% of its US holdings. These interventions, Steve and I argue, are organized through the stewardship divisions the big three have established to engage in routine, behind-the-scenes coordination with management on an ongoing basis. So this management is not out in front. It's not necessarily occurring through shareholder meetings. It's occurring through kind of direct coordination behind the scenes between these stewardship divisions and the management of industrial corporations. Therefore, we find the big three are not just universal owners, but, as noted, actively involved in the internal operations of the corporations in which they are invested. Okay, this is the last point, and I'll push it back over to Steve afterwards. The rise of these asset firms and the new fusion between corporate ownership and corporate control this entailed was tied together, we show, with the development of a new form of state, right? A new form of state which we call the risk state, which was aimed at using state power to absorb and to deflect financial risk. By providing extensive liquidity to stabilize and de-risk the system, the state inadvertently, we argue, facilitated the consolidation of this new form of finance capital. This can be seen most clearly through the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing programs, and we can talk, of course, more about this afterwards. However, to return to a point I made earlier, this state intervention did not represent what Brenner has called political extraction, right? Or anything like this. Rather, it was primarily aimed at stabilizing shadow money and the market-based financial system because of its functionality to capitalism and ensuring the continued operation of the market-based financial system and shadow or repo money in the provision of global credit. This is a state acting in the general interest of the global capitalist system, right? And of course, as we conclude, this intervention produced itself new contradictions and new tensions, which are only starting to be played out right now, and which, of course, will demand in the future another book. But that remains to be seen. Okay, Steve, I'll give it over to you to talk about some of the political implications of this and pull out more the core arguments that are running through the analysis.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah. So from that history, we basically we try to make six kind of central arguments, six key arguments. The first is that financialization is not new. So you often hear the case made in the literature that finance is kind of part of a late stage of capitalism, characterized by decline, exhaustion of accumulation, and exhaustion of industrial accumulation. And so there's like this kind of imminent decline or collapse of industrial capitalism. But as we show, the finance was actually critical to the early growth and dynamism of capitalism. no financialization, no multinational corporation. So finance didn't just emerge as part of this or ascend to its current status as part of a late stage of capitalist development, but was actually intrinsically, essentially important to the early health and dynamism of accumulation. It integrated the U.S. economy. It turned the U.S. market from a regionalized kind of relatively, regionally separated market into one national market. It helped to form the national and then multinational corporation. It was an essential ingredient in forming the national and then later the multinational corporation. And then we show, after the demise of the investment banking empire of J.P. Morgan, a new form of financialization emerged right in the heart of the post-war golden age of capitalism that is usually held up as the paradigmatic example of the good pre-financialized Keynesian capitalism. And so we show, in fact, that at that very moment, a new form of financialization was emerging from the very contradictions of that configuration. And this was precisely because of the effort to suppress and separate finance from the corporations. As a result of that, these firms internalized a range of financial functions for which they had previously relied on the banks. So attempting to separate financial and industrial capital into watertight compartments, as the New Deal regulations aim to do, in fact, only led non-financial corporations to internalize financial functions that had previously been carried out by the banks. And indeed, it created competitive incentives for them to do so. Then later, we show how, as the Keynesian period, the post-war decades, carried on, the financialization of the non-financial corporation, it effectively meant that the distinction between a non-financial corporation and a financial institution became increasingly blurry, such that by the time you reach the 1970s crisis, you have the top managers of non-financial corporations had effectively evolved into money capitalists, in the sense that these non-financial corporations by that time, as a result of internationalization, as a result of the increasing complexity of managing these firms that came with diversification, as they're getting involved in a range of different business operations, which are often only connected to each other in a very limited kind of fashion, internal capital markets basically develop within the non-financial corporation, as individual business operations, usually organized into divisions, are competing with one another inside the firm to receive investment, from the top management. So top managers are kind of like investors or money capitalists allocating a fixed pool of investment funds across competing corporate divisions. So they're basically like financial institutions, allocating capital across within and across a portfolio of financial assets, which is how they came to see corporate operations. The second key argument we try to make is that finance and industry aren't separate. And obviously, this comes right out of the previous point, right? The common framing that you see very often is that finance is the cause of bad capitalism as compared with good capitalism, which is led by manufacturing firms during the post-war decades. Of course, as we show in the book, finance and industry are always interconnected. Finance is essential for accumulation in every period at all times. But their interests of financial and industrial fractions of capital have now become all but indistinguishable with globalization and the financialization of the non-financial corporation. Now, it's important to recognize that we're not arguing, as Greta Krippner and others argue, that the financialization of the non-financial means that these firms have become banks, that non-financial corporations have become banks. We're arguing that they become financial institutions in the sense of money capital playing this increasingly important role within the structure of the firm, within the institutional logic of the firm, as top managers basically become investors. And so as a result of that, especially with globalization and the role that finance plays in securing and enabling globalization, the interests of financial and industrial fractions of capital today are all but indistinguishable, right? Globalization, the finance provided the basic infrastructure that allowed multinational firms, industrial firms, to construct international networks of production and to circulate investment across borders. as they constructed flexible cross-border networks of production and investment. So the interests between financial and industrial firms became increasingly close over this period. The basic point is that you cannot separate a discrete group of industrial capitalists who have supposedly been victimized by globalization from financiers who have benefited from globalization, right? The period of neoliberal financial hegemony that Scott just laid out was indeed marked by financial institutions capturing a larger share of the total social surplus, the total profit. But it was also characterized by the rejuvenation and the strengthening of industrial capital as well. And that was enabled by the rise of finance. So finance and industry are not separate. And that brings me to the third point, which again follows right out of the second point, which is that financialization does not signify the decline of capitalism. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're obviously all aware that we're currently living through a period of immense social crisis, right? The exploding economic inequality has led to a range of, you could look at any indicator you like of human development, health, longevity, et cetera. The extreme increase in economic inequality in our current period has led to a profound social crisis in which working class people are suffering immensely. We also are aware, I think, all of us, that we're living through a period of intense environmental crisis. Ecological collapse is accelerating around us every single day, as we can see from reading any newspaper on a daily basis. But this is not the same thing as an economic crisis. As a matter of fact, capital is causing those social and environmental crises and is benefiting from them. And it is, in fact, the strength of capital that is reflected in the disciplining of labor and the increasingly precarious nature of working class life, and is destroying the environment as competitive pressures have intensified to use raw materials and natural resources in the most efficient possible way, to reconfigure agricultural production along the lines of monocropping, et cetera. This is all about competitiveness. This is all about profit maximization. And it's indeed reflected in and led to a severe ecological crisis. But capital has benefited from that. The point is that, as we argue in the book, finance was a solution, not a problem for capital coming out of the 1970s crisis, right? It restored profits and it facilitated the expansion of globalization, which rejuvenated industrial corporations. Today, profits are sky high. Managerial compensation is sky high. That's not a crisis for industrial capital. Meanwhile, it's simply a myth that industrial investment has declined in the neoliberal period. In fact, investment is completely in line with the post-war norm, and in fact is even elevated somewhat in the current period. Similarly, R&D spending, corporate R&D spending has not declined in the neoliberal period as a result of financial parasitism, redirecting investment away from long-term fixed capital investment and R&D spending. Indeed, R&D spending too is elevated. Corporate R&D spending has gone up. It appears as if corporate investment has declined if you look at this as a percentage of profits. But profits are extremely high. And so since profits are extremely high, if you measure investment as a percentage of increasingly very high profits, it looks low. But if you measure investment as a percent of GDP, then you see that investment has indeed remained strong throughout the neoliberal period, right through to today. So it's ironic, I think, that the case that investment has collapsed with the rise of financial hegemony relies on seeing that as a percentage of exploding profitability that has come with the neoliberal financialization period that accompanied the neoliberal period of financialization, and was indeed partly a result of financialization. So it's kind of a slippery argument that's made there. The fourth key point we try to make is that financialization is not monopolization. So we see this absolutely standard framing in the literature that capitalism had a competitive phase, which gradually gave way to a monopolistic phase. And that occurred as processes of concentration and centralization mean that you end up with markets that are dominated by a smaller number of larger firms, right? So therefore monopolies, fewer firms, that means that you have a monopoly. And this is basically relying on this framing of competition relies on what the economist John Weeks referred to as the quantity theory of competition. And in this conception of what competition is all about, the economy has moved from a period of perfect competition to more and more imperfect competition over time as the number of sellers in a particular market declines. Scott and I argue, on the other hand, that competition is not a function of the number of firms in a sector, but is rather a function of capital mobility. As the ability to circulate investment across sectors and across space increases, as it becomes easier to move investment around, pressure on all investment outlets to maximize profits intensifies. So all of a sudden, you have a situation when capital mobility is increasing, you have a situation where every single outlet for investment has a choice. Either you maximize profits or you face the withdrawal of investment. So basically, competition happens as capital is moving away from those outlets that have relatively low returns and into those outlets that have relatively high returns. So the result is to intensify competitive disciplines on all investment outlets to maximize returns and maximize efficiency. What this means then is that since the large corporation is actually the most mobile form of capital, has the lowest transaction into new opportunities to pursue profitability and restructure away from operations that may be less profitable. So as the mobility of capital has increased with the development of the financial system and the large corporation, so too has competitiveness. So finance then is a matter of increasing the mobility and competitiveness of capital across all sectors and across space. The fifth argument we try to make is that the state never retreated. And this is, again, something you saw a lot coming out of the 1990s debates that supposedly laissez-faire meant a weaker, smaller, hands-off state. Now you see the argument made very often that finance, a parasitic financial sector, has captured the state. And forces it to do its bidding. So the state is kind of the weak, subservient tool of the dominant sector of capital, which in these framings is finance. In fact, what we argue is that the rise of finance was enabled by the formation of a more authoritarian state that was more closely and deeply integrated with the financial system. And this led to what we refer to as the statization of finance, whereby the institutions and assets that are at the center of the financial system have become basically completely encased by state power today. So the major centers of credit generation, the banking system, et cetera, has become all but fused with state power, as have the key markets that are related to the shadow banking sector today, extending the protections that were given to the traditional banking sector after the 1930s crisis to the shadow banks of today, including firms like BlackRock. We can talk more about that in the discussion if you want to. The sixth key argument we try to make is that finance capital is distinct from neoliberalism. So the current period since 2008 has seen unprecedented concentration and centralization of ownership in the hands of the big three financial institutions. And this has led to a lot of speculation that these firms are basically setting up a planned economy of some sort. That because they are universal owners, as the phrase goes, that means that the large number of firms that they control, which are oftentimes competing with one another in the same sector, in the same market, they have an incentive not to compete with each other anymore because they're all owned by one of the big three. They're all owned collectively by the big three asset management companies. And so there's a strong incentive for them not to compete, but instead to recognize their common interests in enriching their owners. As we show in the book, this is completely false. The system that we see is still capitalism. It's still marked by the competition at the firm level and the interventions by the asset management companies who own basically every, an average of 20% of basically every publicly traded company. The interventions by the asset management companies that own the entire publicly traded economy have been around maximizing firm level competitiveness, intensifying the exploitation of labor, and so on. So there's no way in which this amounts to a planned economy. And this is important, these six arguments, because they connect with the politics of this. Like probably one of the main reasons I would say we wrote the book, and certainly a very important takeaway from the book, are the political implications of this analysis. And basically, I think there are three major social democratic arguments that we try to take on in the book. The first is that there is no viable today worker industry alliance to rein in finance. That politics is a non-starter. The idea that workers can form an alliance with their bosses, industrial capitalists, to rein in the real exploiters, the bad capitalists, the financial capitalists, by siding with the good capitalists, the industrialists, is a non-starter. First of all, the industrial firms themselves are so deeply financialized that they're basically financial institutions. They're almost indistinguishable from financial institutions. But moreover, the interests of these industrial firms are completely interlinked with financial institutions and particularly around the continuation of globalization. So the idea of a worker industry alliance to rein in finance is a complete non-starter. The second key point we try to make is that the idea of a worker finance alliance around the environment or fiscal expansion is also a non-starter. So we see the argument made from time to time still that, because these big three asset management companies are universal owners, they have an interest in getting their portfolio companies to internalize externalities such as climate change. And therefore, they have an interest in doing something very significant to deal with the climate crisis, for example, that if there was a competitive market where each individual firm was just externalizing all these costs, wouldn't happen. And so this regime in which these big three firms have such widespread ownership supposedly creates the possibility for workers to form an alliance with these massive financial institutions to do something about the environment. And as we show, that's also a complete non-starter, right? Same with fiscal policy, right? There was a lot of speculation more early in Biden's presidency that these firms were perhaps less committed to low inflation monetary regime than traditional financial institutions and banks are. And so therefore, maybe they would be more open to expansive fiscal policy and social spending and so on. And as we show, that's absolutely not the case. They remain committed to austerity. They remain committed to globalization and class discipline, right? Insofar as they're interested in profit maximization at the firm level, which they are also therefore dependent on maintaining labor discipline and therefore the continuation of austerity and certainly not constructing an expansive social democratic regime. The third social democratic argument we try to take on is that the main problem with capitalism today is that it's monopolistic. And so the political task, we need Elizabeth Warren to come in and save us all by restoring competitiveness, break up the monopolies, break up Amazon, restore competitiveness. And supposedly that's a pro-worker, social justice oriented, progressive political agenda. And as we argue, that is absolutely not the case. First of all, workers have no interest in competitiveness. Competitiveness means class discipline. Competitiveness means profit maximization. Competitiveness means labor exploitation and putting workers in competition with one another for jobs and states in competition with one another for corporate investment by multinational corporations. So workers have no interest in restoring competitiveness. We actually instead have to be finding pathways to mitigate competitive disciplines and market dependence. And to find pathways to build alternative economic institutions based around social ownership and collective control, et cetera, ultimately pointing in the direction of the need for an economic planning regime, a democratic economic planning regime that would be an alternative to market dependence and profit maximization, that would allow for the creation of an economy oriented around meeting social and ecological need. Again, to return to a point that Professor Mattei made in her presentation, the logic of need is antithetical to the logic of profit, as she put it. And I think that's very well said. So the only way we get toward a logic of need is if we start finding ways to mitigate and ultimately reduce market dependence and competitive discipline. And that means ultimately an alternative democratic mechanism for allocating investment besides profit maximization and monetary returns. So step one would be, rather than bailing out the financial system the next time that there's a financial crisis, nationalize it, put it under public control, and find inroads to build a democratization of the central bank and of the financial system. And also the climate change, the climate crisis that we're facing also provides, it's obviously horrible and scary and destructive, but it also provides us with the opportunity to make the case that capital cannot deal with this crisis. The capitalist state cannot deal with this crisis. We need an alternative economic logic and an alternative economic method for allocating investment that, again, is not disciplined by competitive pressures and profit maximization. So I can leave it there, and we can open it up to some discussion. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. I hate talking on Zoom. I always feel like I'm looking at myself, and I when I speak, when I talk, I'm used to like looking at people's faces and like seeing how are you responding? Are you getting it? And so I feel like I'm just kind of in some weird dystopia, like screaming at a piece of plastic or something. But I hope that was comprehensible, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Scott. Let me try to let me put an aside in first. One time I got to spend time at a conference listening to Omarova, Sully Omarova. And she spoke fast enough that I said, if I ever have her here, and I've invited her and I have had a little correspondence with her, I would have to put her on break every 10 minutes and have a breakout room for us to catch up with. And for you gentlemen, it would be almost the same thing. But for everyone here, there's questions lined up, and I'm going to go off in a moment. But I just want to give a few thoughts. You may have a comment, and but it's just some insights, or not insights, it's observations rather. And it's putting it together. And I wanted to share with you sort of where our strategy has been relative towards what you're saying historically. And I want to see what comments you may have there too. And it'll just take a moment. Right at the end, you did come across with a goal. So that allowed me to do some extra planning in that way. A democratic planning regime based on need rather than greed and competition or this competitiveness. And also we need to consider nationalizing. And, and I've thought of that too. When we have a crisis, it's a natural, say Obama in 2009, he could have nationalized the banks because they were insolvent at that point. That might have been something for us to have thought about. And then, what's the plan? We got to have then a plan to bail out or think of or make solvent Main Street and the side streets, but not Wall Street, or to work that out somehow. And we think, it's opening up our thinking on that in that way a bit. But to go back, and so I'm thinking about the best way to go forward, and sort of historically, just to go back into that 1880, 1929 period, it's an interesting time. But prior to that too, the state, whereas we want the government to have control of money creation, the state also had control of corporations by giving charters. And you get a 20-year charter for the first two banks, for example. It's interesting that I'm listening to you and I think, holy mackerel, the state lost that. They don't control the corporations now. And the corporations sort of are now managing themselves in ways. And also the government, from kings, queens, Caesars in earlier periods, created the money. They had the seigniorage to be able to spend it first into circulation. And now they've lost that, and corporations have taken over that too. And our drive is to stop banks from creating money. That's one of our big pushes. And so coming back, say, to this morning for a quick jump up, and we have different thoughts than this too, or different ways, and we discussed it right afterwards with our Swedish colleague, Samuel Kazan, is that, is that, oh, the Macmillan approach is that with Macmillan there's a solvency rule. And with that solvency rule, Stephen Scott, is that you would lose shadow banking. It forces shadow banking to be lost. In these two books, The End of Banking and Capitalism and the Market Economy, in these two books, it's a banker's, thinking in their own paradigm, not in this larger paradigm, but in their own paradigm. But they see that they want to change their own system, and they're very concerned in terms of social welfare. They're also concerned about the climate, and they say banking is failing, and they look at it as the string is breaking, or rope is breaking. And what the suggestion then is, in that phase, when you describe that neoliberal period of money market mutual funds, interest rate swaps and the derivatives and the repo market, there's an idea of working of how to end that. So that's been sort of one of our goals as to cut into what Omarova calls as maybe ending in some ways that secondary market.
So both Scott and I are quite, our position is pretty close in some ways to Omarova, although we're further to the left than she is, of course. But I think her plan, the National Investment Authority plan that she has sketched out, Scott and I both see that as an important step toward democratizing the central bank in a way that could potentially lead to a much more democratic method for allocating investment and credit. And so we're both pretty familiar with her work, and I think we're probably on the same page.
Okay. Yeah, we're figuring it out. We're coming up with a future model. So we're looking at future models. Another one is this whole notion of corporations. We're friends with the Move to Amend people, if you're familiar with that organization, and they're arguing against personal corporatehood, and the idea of banking corporations, banks and their power, we want to radically curtail their abilities to, obviously, in just what we said around shadow banking. We're not between public banking and we're worried about all banks, and some of us are worried about everything should be public banking and there shouldn't be any shadow banking. It's a very conservative approach, but we're open-minded to how we need to think about things and go into the future. So corporations in general, but it's so from listening to your goals at the end, yes, we're overlapped with you, and then we're at the point of absorbing everything you're saying now and trying to see how we can march. I was at DNC and I marched 6 hours there in the Palestinian group, but I also marched with the Move to Amend people. So I got both at the same time. So anyhow, it's
I'm glad you were there.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, but anyhow, let's turn it over to questions from other people. We've got a long line, and Patrick, you're up first, and there's people waiting behind you too.
I'll make it quick. I was very impressed, Professor Maher, with your discussion of the military-industrial complex and how it shows the integration of state functions to really promote capital accumulation markets abroad. We got under Trump to 57% of non-discretionary federal government spending going to the military-industrial complex. I wondered if you could explain the role that plays in helping us understand the basic function of the state vis-a-vis corporations. Second, and then a third quick, what happened in the 70s Why did we have a Volcker price shock? Why did Bretton Woods fall apart? Why is that a central hinge pivot point? And third, how do we think about financial liberalization, deregulating the banks, lifting capital controls, uncapping usury? And finally, is that why we have such wealth inequality? Three people, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and what's his name? Having more.
Oh, Elon Musk. No, you got him.
Bezos.
Oh, you Bezos.
50% of the country, and half of our retired people on $30,000 a year. So really, I'm looking at those three things: the interpenetration of the state to promote capital accumulation, the collapse and fall and rise of it in the 70s, with all of this thing to follow all the way up through the end of Clinton. And now we land with this tremendous wealth inequality. I just thought you could hit those points.
Thanks, Patrick. It's nice to be able to interact with you somewhat in person because we're obviously friends on Facebook, and so I see you on Facebook a lot. But now it's like a face and a voice to the icon on the screen, which is kind of nice.
Thank you.
So good to meet you. Not in person, but I guess kind of close to being in person. So thanks for the kind words on the military industrial complex work I did with the GE book. And so just to put it briefly, I mean, the role of the military industrial complex, I think there's like a range of classical literature that effectively holds that, the military industrial complex is planning. There's the Pentagon Capitalism book that a lot of people used to read in the 70s. And, it's kind of like an economic planning system or something like that. And the way that I have framed it, I think, makes more sense historically, which is that there's a kind of interlocking system of public and private investment where the state supports basic research and development and so on for military purposes related to its security interests and imperial interests, of course, and the private sector contractors with the military industrial complex, their job is to spin off to develop the military technologies for profit and produce them, but then to spin them off as consumer and industrial product lines that can meet with demand on the market and make profit for those firms. So it's kind of like the goodie bag that they get for participating in the military industrial complex. They get to profit from military production, and then they get to own those technologies, which the top managers in those firms kind of invest in based on a competitive logic of where they think they can get a consumer or industrial product market, and develop those technologies competitively to meet market demand. So there's a kind of interlocking system of public and private investment, which ultimately supports the basic research and development. So there's different stages of research and development, right? And the primary stage, the first opened what they call blue sky research. It basically there's very little direct market applicability for that kind of research, and so there's basically no incentive for private corporations, for-profit institutions to undertake that work. So the state does that, and the private institutions, the corporations, kind of develop that knowledge and those technologies in a kind of downstream fashion to make it more marketable to private markets. So like the iPhone, for example, every single technology in the iPhone was developed for military purposes with state investment. And it was later engineered and reconfigured to make it assembled into a consumer product that we all now buy. But every technology in there was developed with state money. And it's the same thing with the pharmaceutical industry too, not necessarily the military industrial complex, but there's like a pharma industrial complex that's pretty similar. So the structure of American industrial policy is actually reflected in the formation of the multi-divisional corporation itself. Because as these companies that were plugged in with the military industrial complex invested in these different products to developing military technologies into these different consumer products, they formed divisions around each of the products that they were creating. And so the multi-divisional corporation, the conglomerate form itself was kind of a creature of the US industrial policy, the structure of US industrial policy. I hope that gets at what you were asking. The 70s crisis, I guess I'll just say a word about it, and then I'll turn that over to Scott because he's done a lot with Bretton Woods. Scott's first book also deals a lot with Bretton Woods, and so I think I'll let him cover some of that. But the 70s crisis, I mean, there's different ways of framing it, right? One way of framing the 1970s crisis is that workers rebelled and therefore they squeezed corporate profits. So there's a profit squeeze crisis that's rooted in an offensive by labor. And so labor is very powerful in order to be able to do this, to cause a system-wide profitability crisis. Labor goes on the offensive and somehow squeezes profits for capital. Another way of framing it, which is the one that Scott and I adopt, so that would be the Keynesian kind of framing. The way that Scott and I frame it is that there was a post-war wave of technological development that underpinned a certain rate of exploitation and therefore corporate profitability. And that was based on a particular set of technologies that were able to sustain that rate of exploitation and also support rising, rising real wages year over year alongside increasing corporate profits based on this increasing rate of exploitation. That was the regime that we know of as productivism. Then that wave of technological development was exhausted and the rate of exploitation fell. And so labor was able to wage defensive battles to prevent the restructuring that capital needed to implement in order to ratchet up the rate of exploitation. Labor was able to wage a series of defensive battles to prevent the restructuring that capital was trying to undertake to increase the rate of exploitation and restore profitability, thereby prolonging that crisis and leading to stagflation. But ultimately, the combination of the Volcker shock, which raised unemployment substantially and therefore put downward pressure on wages, as well as globalization, which massively expanded the reserve army of labor, right? Put workers in the global north in competition with workers in extremely low wage zones on the global periphery, as corporations internationalize production. So the combination of those two things then secured wage restraint, right? Held down real wage growth and allowed for the restoration of profitability, even as productivity gains resumed. So you saw the rate of exploitation ratchet up because real wages in the global north were held back, and you saw the rate of exploitation rise again with regard to future waves of technological development, including on the global periphery. So what Marxists would call both absolute and relative surplus value, emerged once again to restore profitability. So I'll leave that there, and I'll let Scott maybe comment on that, and then your question about the banks as well. I'll leave that to him.
So the 1970s crisis is, and the period of the 1970s, the collapse of Bretton Woods is certainly critical to the history of U.S. financialization, and for many reasons. The standard account, of course, is that with the collapse of Bretton Woods and the collapse of the dollar gold link, you have the rise of a fiat currency regime, and you have central banks being able to independently generate credit outside of the restraint of the gold standard. And there's some truth to that, obviously. The dollar gold link did impose certain limitations on the Federal Reserve's ability to create credit, but really by that time, credit generating capacities of banks and the Federal Reserve far outweighed or far exceeded the gold stock held by the US. So credit money was already by the early 1960s and late 1950s on its way to delinking from gold. But there's some significance to that. With the financial liberalization that occurs with the end of Bretton Woods, though, you do have critically the rise of private currency markets and private interest rate markets, which lead in turn to derivative markets. They're tightly linked to the development of financial derivatives. And this sparks, of course, a long wave of financial deregulation, right? As you have cascading kind of deregulation in the US and elsewhere, corresponding to the freeing up of currency rates and interest rates. And there's a need to develop financial engineering capacities and competencies to allow for these credit markets, these currency markets and interest rate markets to function outside of state discipline, outside of the restraints that were imposed, including capital controls on financial markets during the Bretton Woods period. So one has to understand, therefore, the liberalization that occurred in the post-1970s period as occurring in part as a result of the collapse of the dollar gold link. These things are completely interconnected. So, we could certainly talk at greater length about all this. I'll kind of skip a little bit to it, a little bit kind of to the Volcker shock point because it's connected. In the absence of any type of link on the US dollar, inflation management and inflation control becomes critical to the credibility of the dollar and the capacity of the dollar to serve as international currency. And you can see and you could read the Volcker shock as an attempt to rein in, right, or to impose new constraints on U.S. currency and credit creating capacities of the federal government, and to restrict the monetization that had kind of crept into federal policy after the 51 Fed Treasury Accord. So you have, in a sense, inflation targeting replacing the dollar gold link as a restraint on the capacity of the government to print money, right? And it's a bit of a crude interpretation, but I think it serves as a basic heuristic. And then getting into the point about banking, can you, Patrick, remind me what the question was on that one?
Just that there was lifting of capital controls and lifting of leverage requirements and lifting of the wall between investment banking and insured deposits, culminating in the Commodity Future Markets Modernization Act and the Glass-Steagall wall being taken down.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long process of financial deregulation, really from 1974 onwards, with the final collapse of the dollar gold link in 1973, and this kind of lasts for 20-25 years. And interestingly, as you know, the deregulation of the financial system starting in the 1970s sparks a significant destabilization of the banking system through the 1970s, through the 1980s, that has to be managed by an independent Federal Reserve. And so alongside this financial deregulation, the breaking down of Glass-Steagall barriers, the elimination of Regulation Q, etc., you have the development of an increasingly authoritarian and powerful central bank that has to manage these contradictions. And the development of what we call the neoliberal authoritarian states, very tightly connected to all these transformations in the banking system. But alongside that, I think really what's important to know, to understand, is that during this period, during the neoliberal period, and alongside this financial deregulation, you get a new system of credit capacity, credit generating capacities within the financial system. The financial system moves away from a traditional bank-based model and increasingly towards a market-based financial model, right? Which interconnects investment banks, hedge funds, commercial banks, mortgage markets, etc., into a long chain of intermediation. And that new system of credit generating, that new credit generating market-based financial system is, of course, contradictory, but it becomes more and more functional to accumulation, and it becomes a larger and larger center of total credit generating capacity, with industrial firms in particular relying on it increasingly to generate credit. And so financial liberalization and deregulation is not just about the banks becoming more powerful. It's about a complete and utter transformation of the credit system, one that was led in part by the Federal Reserve in the interest of stabilizing the system, to take some of the weight of its own shoulders of having to manage an increasingly crisis-prone financial system. But this is not just, it's not just, chaotic. It is managed and it's stabilized to a certain degree, as much as it ever can be stabilized, by the state through the increasing authority of the state, and through the statization of the incorporation of the financial system and the blurring of the state of public-private boundaries that this entails. So I'm not sure if that directly addresses the question. It's more of a historical kind of commentary on deregulation, but hopefully it gets to some of the points.
It was enlightening, and thank you, Patrick. Let's go on and get a few additional questions. Nick, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm in crisis. I think our whole country is in crisis. Our democracy is threatened. I mean, I spent the last 20-some years on the street corner screaming about it as an activist, and I understand our democracy is not very democratic, but at least it's a little bit. And we could start with somebody mentioned move to amend, which evidently you're not familiar with. And I would suggest you go there, movetoamend.com, and sign the petition, and maybe let your students know about this petition. What it is to overthrow the Citizens United, the terrible Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which allows unlimited spending in the political process. And the examples are abound on this. We can start with an article I just read the other day that the cryptocurrencies are spending more on the presidential election than everybody else combined. And they want something from it. Now we're advocating for monetary reform to take the money power, the power to create our money away from banks and put it with our government and with us through our democracy, which isn't very democratic. But that's what we're trying to overcome. And we've got an election right now that if one guy wins, he'll throw me in jail. He said it. People that disagree with him and that are against him, he's putting us in jail. And I hope you can do something to stop it. but seriously, this is our position. And you're talking about, I mean, I've got friends in the anti-war movement, social justice movement, environmental movement, you know, academics and everything. And we're talking about labor and workers. And the fact is that the average union worker in the United States is 50-50 for democracy or not, or 50-50 for Donald Trump. They have no interest in doing what you want to be done for them to make their lives better. And I'm going to leave it at that. But I do appreciate we're all on the same page, kind of. We're trying to get there with a reform of our monetary system. And this is not monetary policy or anything. When I hear people talk about monetary, no, it isn't. It is to take the power to create money and put it with the people through our Congress so that we have that power and we get the benefit from it, and we can also direct the money creation to those things that we think are most important. And we can start with environmental issues and social issues too. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Any quick comments or thoughts, or we'll go on to others? Steve or Scott? Stephen or Scott?
Maybe one brief point. I understand, you know, a lot of what he was getting at. I didn't see his name. I couldn't read it on my thing, but Nick, yeah. I mean, the question about workers and Trump, I mean, I think it's obviously the case that in unions like the Teamsters, you know, you see that there's pretty split 50-50. But that's not the case in every sector, of course. But I mean, what this indicates is just how far we have to go. And if the question is why center workers in the process of changing the world, well, to me, it's clear. Workers have both the structural power to affect change in the capitalist economy because they can withhold their labor and they are ultimately the producers of value in the economy. And number two, they have the numerical majority. So if we're interested in democracy, well, we certainly should appeal to the group of people in society who are the majority, and that's workers. And that doesn't mean we just agree with what workers say. It means we have to win people over to a program of change to use the power that they have to to change the world. And that's exactly why Scott and I wrote this book. And that's what I think anybody who's earnestly committed to the project of getting us out of the disastrous mess that we're in should do, right? Figure out ways to organize a progressive or socialist movement based in the working class to fundamentally change the way that the economy works. And that does not at all preclude the kinds of reforms that Nick was mentioning in my book, in my mind. So,
Thank you. Lee, you have a question?
Yes. So in the 1920s, early 1920s, a German named Heinrich Pesch, based on his experiences in England, described capitalism as theft of human labor and appropriation of all surplus value through state-sponsored usury. That seems to be still consistent with much of what you guys have said and what Professor Mattei has said. I'm wondering, do we need a new state, or would we benefit from the breakup of the American empire?
nice small question. Easy to answer that one in a couple of minutes. Geez. Well, I think it would depend on what you mean by the breakup of the American empire. I mean, the American empire is clearly a bad thing for the world. It inflicts extreme violence on people all over the world constantly. It's currently implicated in the worst genocide since World War II that is ongoing before our very eyes, and untold suffering in contexts all around the planet. So it's not that it's good, it's an evil. Now, the role of the American state as an empire, it affords us the possibility to make change in the United States in a way that has implications that are global immediately. And I think that means that in the belly of the beast, a lot of the most important political actions really have to emanate in a way from the imperial center, which is the United States. I also think, though, that there's a lot of ideas out there and arguments about this emerging multipolar world system, supposedly, in which these opponents of the American empire, at least in some sense, China, Russia, maybe Iran in some people's accounts, are progressive forces in that they are an oppositional power center to the extension of the American empire. And I think that's quite misguided as an analysis. First of all, these states are all deeply integrated with the American empire. They're all deeply integrated with the flows of finance and capital that make global capitalism that ultimately is the structural basis for the imperial state, the power of the American imperial state. Secondly, none of these countries, not Russia, not China, certainly not Iran, represent anything like an alternative. They are neck deep in not just American financial markets, but specifically in their own social formations. They have engaged in the same forms of neoliberalization and so on that we've seen in the United States and elsewhere. And there's no reason to believe whatsoever that they represent an alternative for the global periphery in particular to the same kinds of core periphery relationships, indebtedness, et cetera, that has characterized the American empire. So I think there is a complex moment in which, despite the fact that there has been a kind of fragmentation of power within the American empire, clearly the American state can't just do whatever it wants, like it could in 2003, for example. But at the same time, that fragmentation of power does not mean that those centers of power that are within the American empire, but that sometimes get into political conflicts with the American state, like China, like Russia, it does not mean that they represent a progressive or positive development for the world. Among other things, it's bringing us right to the edge of nuclear war at the moment, which is a dire concern of mine, and I hope of everybody's. So, yeah, that would be kind of how I would see that. I think that we need to see the political objective not as building up alternative capitalist states in our minds or in reality that can supposedly confront the American capitalist state, but ending capitalism and coming up with a different kind of economic system. So waging a struggle within the state, not between states.
Thank you, Stephen. Well put. Joe? And I'm sorry to the audience that I'm not able to spotlight you for some reason, but I can talk to you. So Joe, please, you're next.
Hi, that was extremely interesting. And as Stephen said, maybe we'll have to rewatch it on YouTube and slow it down a little. It was very concise and very packed full of good information. My question is, would ending interest on reserves be part of this democratizing the central banks that you described, and which they're now profiting from the anti-inflation policy by getting that interest? And is that collection of money kind of a double dipping since they already lend out to the max with their financial resources? Thank you.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, so as it currently stands, the U.S. monetary regime is based around what's called an interest on excess reserves system, in which the federal funds manages the massive surplus of reserves in the system created as a result of the bond buying program or programs surrounding the 2008 crisis by incentivizing the banks it charters or it controls to hold capital in the federal funds market with high interest rates. And basically, instead of the typical system of overnight borrowing, where it takes a small portion of money out of the federal funds market or puts a small portion of money into the federal funds market to address to shape overnight interest rates and thus the yield curve more generally, what it's doing is just basically providing more interest or less interest to central banks to hold a specific amount of reserves in place and manage the market. What that ends up doing in a high interest rate environment is basically, yes, giving banks an enormous, amount of capital, right? So if they're holding, hundreds of millions of dollars in the federal funds market, as some of the big four banks are, and they're earning 5-6% on that, it wouldn't be 6%. But if they're earning, 5% on that, then that adds up pretty quickly. Is that fair? Is that correct? Is that the right way of doing things? No. It was a product of the contradictions of managing the 2008 financial crisis. The Fed is somewhat aware of these problems, and I think it's one of the things that we could put on our agenda. But to me, it's well down the list. Right? I don't think ending interest on reserves and going back to a basic system of overnight lending would do anything, quite frankly, to address the democratic deficit that we have where, authoritarian central banks control fiscal policy, right? It would be a nice little step in the right direction. I'm not in favor of big banks, getting free interest either, right? But to me, what we have to address is the structural problems within the state that confer enormous power to some and no power to others, and that goes well beyond IOER. The basic point is this: before 2008, we didn't have an IOER system, and the central bank and the state was as undemocratic as it is right now. And so, if the proposal is let's just go back to 2007, I don't think that takes us anywhere.
Somewhere,
Thank you very much.
Nowhere fast, nowhere enough. Nevis.
Sure, Steve, you got the name right. So, I have thank you for the amazing presentation. Maybe I have a rookie kind of a question here. It takes a tangent, as in I see proposal of the sovereign money system to be like maybe I'm not giving the right keywords here, to be centralized with taken away from the commercial banks. But when I was reading some history, the reason currently Federal Reserve was formed in its current hybrid structure with this public-private, some people have different opinions on it, but was cited as Bank of England 1694 example, where the government had the power to create money indirectly, the kingdom and stuff. So where I'm connecting all these dots is, are we entering into a cycle where moving money creation away from commercial banks and to another centralized authority, which is also bound to be corrupt? A corruption possibility may happen. So my fear is if we continue the centralization, are we entering into a cycle? I hope my question makes sense. The example I wanted to cite was Bank of England, 1694, when it was the opposite case and they still had the same problem.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, I think one thing I would say is that I think one of the lessons of our book, or that one of the main arguments of our book, is that corruption, finance is not about corruption per se. I mean, there's different ways that central banking and state power can be organized, which may be more or less functional for the reproduction of capital and for the circulation of financial capital. There may be more or less crisis-prone ways that the state can be organized in terms of its relationship to financial capital. But finance itself and the centralization of state power is not a matter of corruption or dysfunction. It evolved over time precisely because it's functional. So contradictions emerge, the system's developing historically, contradictions emerge, crisis happens, it has to be resolved. And through that process of working through crises, managing contradictions, the state developed a tremendous amount of capacities, institutional capacities, and power became centralized in the Federal Reserve in the case of the American state, because that's what worked. And there's no time or ability for meddlesome processes like democratic accountability and so on. And when you have to, extend trillions of dollars of liquidity to the financial system on an emergency basis right away. And as a result of that, the fundamental contradiction, this is another thing that Professor Mattei spoke about very well, I think, the fundamental contradiction between capitalism and democracy simply became expressed. There's always a contradiction between capitalism and democracy, and that contradiction became expressed through the centralization of power in the Federal Reserve. And so none of this is about corruption. This is about finding an institutional configuration and an order that works for capital and that got the system through the crises and that made the system more resilient and that allowed capital to remain dynamic in a way that just doesn't work to be accountable to the public, because the public, first of all, democracy takes time, but second of all, they might not agree to go along with what the system needs. And so when there's a contradiction between the systemic needs of accumulation and popular legitimacy or popular democratic input into the process, the political process, well, the system sides with the authoritarian answer because there's no other way forward. So I think I wouldn't frame it as a matter of dysfunction. I would frame it as a matter of the way that capitalism works, in particular with finance. It's the lifeblood of the system.
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to say we do record this, and our members will have plenty of time to go over and digest, and also get your book too along the way. But Bruce, your turn.
I had one short question and a longer question, perhaps. Short question was, I want to know if I understood what you said about Sanders. That Sanders assumes that finance is parasitic on capitalism, and I understood you to say, to the contrary, finance is empowered capitalism. Is that accurate? Okay, good. The other question had to do with whether you would agree that what you're after. I read your book, thanks to Patrick Rose's strong recommendation earlier this year to the whole planning group for AMI, and I found it first extremely shocking or disturbing, and I kept on going all the way through and realized that I was not understanding what was going on. But the last chapter just was wonderful. I mean, the whole book turned out to be a wonderful experience. And my question is whether what you're calling for could be called a reimagining of social democracy, especially the last chapter. It felt to me as if maybe more pointedly, it felt as if what you were recommending there was a kind of specifically publicizing or socializing major infrastructural green dependent industries and so on, which has a precedent. And so the idea that somehow democracy and socialism are not compatible is one of the things that it feels to me needs to be broken down. That's a kind of artificial construction. So that's the quick question. I'm calling for a reimagination of democracy. I hear you calling for a reimagination of socialism, and they feel like they're coming together.
I would say so. I think that's exactly right. To me, there is no difference between socialism and democracy. Socialism just means democracy. And so it's just finding ways to make our society more democratic. To me, that's the only politics that makes sense. And so, but I wouldn't call it social democracy because, well, maybe we're using the term differently, but the way that the term social democracy is often used is to refer to that politics of class compromise, where mostly around Keynesian kind of, a Keynesian kind of regime, such as existed during the post-war decades, in which there was a compromise between capital and labor. And ultimately what we see in those social democratic countries, not just the weaker ones like the UK, but the stronger ones in like Northern Europe and Sweden, is that they're in crisis and they're falling apart because those compromises aren't sustainable over the long term, right? The competitive disciplines of global capitalism, but also just the dynamics of accumulation. Ultimately, that's not supportable over the long run. So you have to go further than social democracy to actually take control over investment, to democratize control of investment, which the social democrats never really wanted to do. They just wanted a distributive bargain, right? They wanted some social programs to support the interests of workers and the well-being of workers within capitalism. And the deal was, we're not going to touch capitalist property relations. We'll let you be the owners of the means of production, but just give us a better share of the benefits, right? A better share of the output, and it takes the form of a kind of welfare state program. And so we're saying you have to go further than that.
That's very helpful. Can I ask one more question, Steve?
Yeah. You got the last one. We're well over, and thank you.
It went into my head and came out just as you were talking. The question has to do with the relationship between money creation and allocation. And I heard you or somebody else say just a minute ago that we're talking about Omarova's NIA and others as focusing on allocation. Not to say that they're not related. In fact, that's the whole point. They are related. So fiscal policy or allocation, it seems to me, is the fundamental. It seems to me fundamental. So that's a question in relation to the two.
No, that's a really important question. Scott and I have wrestled with this. I'm sure Scott has a lot to say. Maybe Scott wants to come in on this, but there's a question about, are you talking about democratizing investment? Are you talking about democratizing credit? Are you talking about, because obviously these things are closely interrelated. And so, the credit system is an enormously powerful center for generating investment, right? And so clearly that has to be part of the puzzle. And I think to us, they go together. But maybe Scott has more specifics to add.
Yeah, I think one has to. So if the proposal is for the democratization of credit markets and the removal of credit generating capacity from private markets and private institutions, I think that's very good, and it's what Steve and I support at the end of the book, for sure, the democratization of finance. But it's, I think, pretty apparent to me, at least, that it would be very difficult to imagine a centralized system of credit provision, right, being compatible with a capitalist system where investment occurs at the micro level. Credit being critical to the economy, as the economy is a monetary economy, because credit is critical to a monetary economy, and because investment is decentralized and occurs at the micro level, you have to have mechanisms of credit provision that are also occurring at the micro level, or you have to challenge the system of investment, right? More generally. So that raises really interesting and really big questions. Could you imagine then the democratization of credit provision at the micro level through a system of public banks that span nationally, but also regionally? I think that's really important. But what this does get at, of course, is private ownership of the means of production in general. And it pushes you to think about, more seriously, a system of economic planning which Steve and I kind of proposed in the last chapter, which is critical to our understanding of democracy, right? And I think once one talks seriously about democratizing credit, one bumps immediately into how a capitalist, how that would be functional within a capitalist economic system. I don't think it would be at all functional within a capitalist economic system. And I think getting to that stage would mean a radical confrontation with capital, to say the very least, because as we note, finance is functional, right? It's critical, it's essential to capital. So once one starts with that understanding, then you realize quickly that democratization, centralization of credit, taking credit creating capacities away from the central bank is not just an easy project. This gets at the very central nervous system of the capitalist economic system and will be resisted full throttle by the capitalist state as well as capital more generally. So these are fundamentally significant questions that are raised by our book, but also, of course, by this question. And I appreciate the question.
Thank you.
And
thanks, Steve.
Thank you too, Bruce. Thank you very much for being a part of this and for putting an abundance of food on our plates.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It was good. Good to have. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Very much.
And,
yes, yes, I agree.
Yeah, and it was great to be here. It looks like a really cool group you guys have put together, and hope we can be in touch in the future.
There's 33 of us, about a little over 30 of us groups around the world. So we have a lot of work. Nevis is from India. And this morning we had a person on from our Swedish group, and connections from other countries too, more than I can think of right now. So we're working, and we want to learn from you all. And also I look forward to getting the GE book and Bretton Woods. We're at Bretton Woods 2.0, and now we're at Bretton Woods 3.0 because we already 2.0. And so anyhow, we've got someday I think of us all as colleagues. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick, too.
Thank you.
Thank you for being
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank
you,
everybody.
Thanks a lot. That was really interesting.
Professor.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.